Welcome to this week's Artist on Art. I am your host, Nada Milkovich, and I have a really wonderful show for you all today. We're going to be talking to two UCSC professors. We have Nathaniel Deutsch. Nathaniel works in the History Department, and he is also the director of the Institute for Humanities Research here at UCSC. And we also have Noah Wardrip-Fruin. He is a professor in the Computer Science Department. He teaches game design for PhD students here and MFA students in the Danham Department. Golly lolly, I thank you both for coming up to talk to me today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. That was Nathaniel Deutsch. Nathaniel, maybe you could start with talking to us a little bit about, basically, you both are here today to talk about an upcoming event that's happening March 1st at 7 o'clock at the Kumbwa. But I gotta first say, at 6 o'clock is when the meet and greet is going to happen. So if you want to come a little earlier, have a few cocktails or drinks, libations, and then the conversation begins, and this is a part of the Questions That Matter series, and this one is called Play, Games, Life, and Death. Nathaniel, this is the second year. What do you think?
So we're very excited about this upcoming event. The first event was last year, was also at Kumba, and it was called Making the Cosmos Local, and it brought together two professors, and the goal of the series is to bring two scholars together, one from the humanities and one from another area of the university, to have a conversation about some of the most important issues and questions that matter to all of us. So that one brought together Anthony Aguirre, who is a professor of theoretical physics here at the university, and Mingwei Hu, who is a professor of Chinese history. And they talked about different kinds of cosmologies, cosmologies that contemporary physics physicists work on, and cosmologies that were developed in both ancient and pre-modern and early modern China. So that had a really enormous response from the community, and we were really heartened by that. And so we now have the second installment, which we're really happy that Noah and Kimberly Lau, who is a professor in the Department of Literature and a folklorist, and they're going to be participating in this upcoming event on Play.
I was so excited about hearing about it last year. I didn't hear about it until after I believe it was sold out, and so I still got to speak with Mingwei, who came on and was also in the process of publishing a book at that time, and he got to kind of tell us how it went after the fact. But this time I wanted to make sure that everybody was well planned and can know that this one is coming up March 1st, and it again will be at the Kumbwa in a very special, intimate setting. And so this year, the Questions That Matter that you'll be talking about is play, and that's why we have Noah Wardrip-Fruin here to talk about how he's going to be talking with Kimberly Lau. And so Kimberly, unfortunately, wasn't able to make it. But Noah, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how you're envisioning this conversation to go.
Sure. Well, I think Kimberly and I are interesting complements to each other. She's someone who comes out of folklore and is obviously in the humanities in the literature department, but she has a real focus on how people and communities engage games. She studies things like how people express masculinity in World of Warcraft, or how they say goodbye to their characters when they're quitting the game, and other things that might have influences on them by the game systems and other technical parts of the game, but really her focus is on the people and what they do and how they communicate with each other, whereas my focus tends to be more on how the game system operates, right? And that shapes human behavior and perception, but I want to look deep in how things maybe beyond the perception even of the people affect what the game is as an artifact. And so I think by bringing together these two perspectives, we should have a pretty interesting conversation about, I think, what are really two of the fundamental sides of how games create meaning.
Well, I think it's really interesting that Kimberly Lau is taking on maybe a more humanitarian point of view, where you're taking on more of the game design system point of view. And so you might say that Kimberly is bringing in the psychology of the games. Would you say that was a fair way of...
Well, I don't want to try to speak too much for Kimberly, but I think what's interesting is that while we might think about something like psychology as a social science, we're definitely in the area where, for both my perspective and Kimberly's, there's a blending of what we would consider the traditional sort of disciplinary or divisional divides. So yeah, once we're focusing on people and how they as individuals and communities experience games, we're inevitably touching on all kinds of things that are sometimes seen as the province of other disciplines. There's psychology and economics as surely as there's literature and history in trying to look at how people behave in games. Yeah.
And Noah Wardrip-Fruin, you're a pretty good person to talk about this because you have a very interesting academic career. In fact, I think I might have used the word an anomaly when we were talking before, but I didn't. That's not the right word. You're certainly unique in how you play in the intersections of these types of disciplines. Mm-hmm. And so would you mind telling us a little bit about how did you get here to UCSC? And I want to congratulate you for becoming a full professor here.
Oh, thank you. So that is recent. So I have always been interested in experiences like games, forms of media that are enabled by computation, whether that computation is carried out by people, as it is in like a complex tabletop game, or whether it's carried out by computers. And so I started playing computer games. My mom was a professor at Cal State Long Beach, started playing them on terminals hooked up to the mainframe there when I was in elementary school. My dad wrote for InfoWorld. I played on K-Pro and Osborne machines that he brought home. And it seemed perfectly natural to me that you would need to study together things like how you make the technical system of the game and how you do things like the writing and art that goes into the game and how you understand the game in historical context. And as an undergrad, I went to an institution not that dissimilar from UC Santa Cruz, in that they were both started in the mid-1960s. I went to a place that's now called the Johnston Center for Integrative Studies, used to be called Johnston College, with no grades, no set curriculum, and so on. And so I was able to put together that kind of design your own degree. And then I started looking for places to go to graduate school, and I totally came up empty. So I ended up, through a circuitous path, being an artist in residence and then a research scientist at New York University. And it was while I was there that I explored the field enough to realize there was a place I could go to graduate school. So I went to Brown and got an MFA in fiction writing because it was pretty much the only MFA that would let you write for a computational system instead of writing for paper, say. And then I stuck around and did a self-designed PhD at Brown, something they call special graduate study that I would love to bring to the Santa Cruz campus, where basically just like you can design your own undergraduate degree here, you could design your own PhD there.
Okay, so you designed your own PhD. What did it look like?
So the most important thing about a PhD, by the time you're sort of, at least in my opinion, the most important thing about a PhD is you're lining up a committee of people who are pushing back on your ideas. And so by having a non-departmental PhD, I was able to line up a group of people who cut across normal program boundaries. So I had Robert Coover, who's a fiction writer. I had Wendy Chun, who is more of a literature scholar. I had the head of the committee was Andy Van Dam, who's a computer scientist. I also had David Durand, who had 1 foot in industry. Well, actually, sort of 2 feet in industry, while also being somebody who was an adjunct at Brown. And then George Landau, who wrote a lot of the early hypertext theory that I started reading when I was an undergrad and helped me get into the field.
I love hypertext. So you're listening to Noah Wardrip-Fruin. He's telling us about how he was able to get his PhD in a you weren't in any division, and how different that is, and maybe is something useful for us to think about in the future as these division walls come down and we start really playing at the intersection of all these different places. And so you came to UCSC in 2009, I believe, and you started working right away in the expressive. Is that correct?
So yeah, my first faculty job was at UC San Diego, and I spent a chunk of my time there trying to convince them to copy the game program that was starting here at UC Santa Cruz. I was like, look, they've got it figured out, right? And then the job was posted here, and I had a long conversation with my wife about whether to apply, because it seemed like it offered the opportunity to just work on the stuff I wanted to do instead of fight for the opportunity to work on the stuff I wanted to do. And I ended up applying, and I was very lucky to get the job, or at least I count myself lucky to get the job. And then one of the questions was, I was coming into the computer science department. Now I'm in a new department called computational media. But I had seen at NYU an interesting model where faculty would run their labs together, as opposed to each lab being sort of province of a lone genius. And it had lots of intellectual benefits. The students would get a broader range of perspectives, and the faculty would bounce off of each other in meetings and so on. But it also had logistic benefits, right? Like, what happens if you're sick? What happens if, right? Do your students just not get any advising? Do your projects just stop? And if you have more than one faculty member collaborating, it doesn't have to happen. So I proposed to Michael Matthias, who was already here and had been here for a couple of years, that we run a lab together. And happily, he agreed, and we've been doing that since then.
And I know as soon as you came, there was a new project group in the Digital Arts and New Media program that allowed for a group of DANM students to work in the computer science program, and that has continued. Your expressive, let's see the term you call it, your expressive intelligence studio is a mixture of both the DANM MFA students as well as the PhD students. How is that working?
I'm really enjoying it, and I think Michael is too. One of the things that we both experienced as graduate students was trying to find interdisciplinary community. So, for example, even though Michael was a PhD student in computer science, he was working with people in the studio for creative inquiry at Carnegie Mellon, which is in the arts. And even though I was coming out of an MFA in creative writing, I was having the biggest group of faculty on my dissertation committee is from computer science, right? And we both were basically loners doing that work. So we wanted to find a way to create more community, and by having students both in the computer science PhD and in the DANM MFA in the same lab together, where basically we try to de-emphasize the difference between the programs and so on, and really focus on who the individual students are and what they want to work on collaboratively and individually. I think we've been able to create that kind of community.
Okay, so I need to ask you, what does the Expressive Intelligence Studio do? Well, I could also just add a little bit of context for our audience. Michael Mateus, when he came to UCSC, he was very well known for a computer program that he had created. It's actually a video game that's called Facade, and it was the first to use artificial intelligence to be able to write a script. And so, that changes on your input.
There'd been this dream of interactive drama, which a lot of people are familiar with from something like the holodeck on Star Trek, right? Where basically you're having some sort of real-time interaction with fully realized characters who have facial expressions, who talk, and so on. And what you say and what you do moving around the space and so on has both a moment-to-moment impact on how they behave, but also a larger impact on how the experience unfolds. And people had talked about that, like Brenda Laurel had talked about that in her dissertation back, and the Oz Project at Carnegie Mellon had worked on it, but Michael and his collaborator Andrew Stern were the first ones to actually make it real. And so it really sort of shocked people at the time. When it came out in 2006, it was the first video game I'd ever seen talked about in the arts section of the New York Times rather than the technology section.
I like it. And so the Facade is a game in which you are going to a dinner with a couple, and you realize very quickly coming into their apartment that they're having an argument. And depending on how you interact with these characters, they could either blow up and have the marriage divorced, terrible fight, or you can actually calm them down and get them to see each other's sides of the story. And for me, it was very uncomfortable.
It's meant to be, right? It's like an interactive Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, right?
Exactly. It was like, oh, way. You already have to see that in real life. You don't want to go there, let alone play a video game. But the bigger story here, again, is that the fact that the computer is actually changing the characters in real time as you're... I know there was one of the people who went on it with me, they figured out how to get thrown out right away. Like there was you could really you can make a pass at the wife or at the husband and you're out, Anyway, so Michael Mateus and you are doing the Expressive Intelligence Studio here, and we're back to questions that matter and why you're here today with Nathaniel Deutsch. And that's because you're going to be talking about play, games, life, and death. That's the question and the dialogue that you're going to be having with Kimberly Lau. And Nathaniel Deutsch is going to be moderating this scintillating conversation. I am sure of it. And if you are interested, please go to the IHR.ucsc.edu, and if you do /play, you'll go straight to all the information about how you can secure your place there. Like I said, last year it sold out, and I jumped on it myself. I just didn't want that to happen again. And it's at the Kumbwa, March 1st, starting at 6 o'clock with a meet and greet kind of libation moment. And then at 7 o'clock, we're all going to sit down and the heavy dialogue is going to start. But I don't think it's going to be that heavy. In fact, it's about play. So really, how heavy can that be? And Kimberly Lau will be bringing the literary side of this conversation, where you might be bringing the system side of the conversation. Would you say that was a good way of saying that, Noah?
I would believe that as a way of putting it, but also, one of the things that's going to happen is Nathaniel is going to ask us questions and then pin us down some, so we may end up in territories that aren't our usual ones. Right.
And that's why you're there, Nathaniel. You're going to poke them with the stick and make them go into maybe some uncomfortable places. You think?
Yeah, you're not supposed to let them know that. But yeah, now that he knows he's going to be prepared.
Right, he won't be all relaxed.
But I think that I think that that's really the spirit of this, is to bring people together who might not otherwise have conversations. They come from different fields. They may, in terms of the university, they come from different disciplines and divisions. And in the same way that Noah built a degree a program for his degree that brought together all these different fields and ideas. That's what we're hoping to do with this series, and I think it's really indicative of the incredible importance of play and of games in contemporary society. That's what the second installment of the series is. I mean, we went from Cosmos to games. And if it weren't for the gamification, as some people have called it, of life that's happened over the last few years, I don't think that would be a transition I don't think that transition would have happened. So for me, that's something we're trying to get across, is that we live in a world in which games have entered almost every corner of our experience, from medical care, education, entertainment, of course, the military, business. I mean, Noah and I have had conversations where, we've talked about, how does the revenue generated by gaming compare to Hollywood, for example?
Oh, well, I can tell you.
Yeah, maybe you can address it. But the fact that we
blown it out of the water.
So the fact that we can even have that conversation and you can respond like that suggests that things are very different than even a few years ago in this regard. And so that's something that I really want to explore. I mean, that's why this is in a series called Questions That Matter, which is about fundamental questions that matter to all human beings, because play has always mattered, but the kind of play and the kind of games that people have now developed to perform all sorts of tasks, like, for example, decrease the pain that burn victims have, or improve the recovery of people who have had concussions, or simulate military operations, which in their own right now resemble games more, arguably, than they do, the last few thousand years of actual military combat on the ground. So it's really fascinating in all these ways. Well,
the military and the video game, they have a very interesting relationship that can go back with the history of video games, which we can talk about later in the show. What I think is interesting is that, as you say, games have really entered into all corners of our lives, and that we're talking about play. And I'm hoping that in the second half of the show, we could start talking about, well, what's the difference between a game and a play? And that's a big question in the gaming world, because we have kind of a line between the ludologists, those that think it just is play, and then those... What side would you be on, Noah?
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess I'd say one of the weird debates that's been happening, I don't know how much people care about sort of debates in the academic world, right? But one of the weird debates that's been happening in the academic world is an argument that, and it's also been happening to some extent in the game design world, that we need to sort of make a divide between people who understand games and game systems formally and those who honor kind of personal experiences of players and game designers. And I think that's kind of like saying we need to make a distinction between people who study city planning and people who understand the experience of being in traffic. It's like, no, actually, if you make that divide, you're screwing up already, right? Like, those things have to be connected for you to understand what's going on.
Right. Yeah. And what a perfect person for us to talk about that with you, Noah.
If I could add something too, one of the reasons why I think it's important for a humanities scholar to be at the table in this conversation, as it were, and what I think Kimberly Lau is going to be discussing, are the fact that in games, questions of identity, questions of community, narrative, storytelling, all of these things are key components of games. And of course, those are also really key elements of the humanities, of the various fields in the humanities, of history, of literature, of linguistics, of philosophy, and so on. I mean, even the question of what is the real? And how do we experience reality? That's the fundamental question of phenomenology, for example. How do we experience the world? What constitutes the world? And so there are people in the humanities, philosophers, literary scholars, and so on, that have already been working on these questions, often in a different format. But to bring that research, to bring those insights now into this new area, I think is really important.
Oh, I completely agree. Nathaniel Deutsch talking to us about games and play and the humanities. We also have Noah Wardrip-Fruin here in the KZSC studios. Nathaniel Deutsch and Noah Wardrip-Fruin, both professors here at UCSC. Nathaniel is a professor in the Department of History here, and he's also the co-director of the Center for Jewish Studies and the director of the Institute for Humanities Research. Noah Wardrip-Fruin is a professor of computational media here at Santa Cruz, and he co-directs the Expressive Intelligence Studio, one of my favorite studios here on campus, with Michael Mateus. He is going to be talking through one of the series that Nathaniel Deutsch started last year, Questions That Matter. And this is a series of public dialogues, and I believe that the Institute for Humanities Research is doing quite an outreach into the public. And would you say this is one of those events? And they're all for the public as well, I understand.
Yeah. No, that's one of the main things that we do. One of our most important missions is to bring the humanities research that's going on here at the university to broader publics in Santa Cruz and even beyond, which is, of course, much easier to do now with the internet and through the collaborations that we have with all sorts of scholars, artists, scientists around the world. But a lot of that happens at the university on campus. And one of the things that we wanted to do increasingly was to bring the campus to the community and to the community of Santa Cruz. And so the Questions That Matter series, which is at Kumba downtown, is one of the ways that we do that, so that people don't have to come all the way up to campus. We bring the professors to you out there in Santa Cruz, and you can not only hear them talk about their areas of expertise, but also ask them questions. And that's one of the really main things that is part of this series, is that at the end of each dialogue, there's a significant period of time where people can ask questions of the professors and have conversations with them themselves.
Nathaniel Deutsch, you were remarking that the last year, which was the first series, which was about cosmology, that you had a really that was one of the highlights of the night for you, was the interactivity with the audience and the scholars that were talking about cosmology from very different perspectives, one being a Confucius Chinese historical point of view, and the other being an astrophysical point of view. Yeah,
so that was one of the things that was really gratifying to me, was what happened after what was a really stimulating conversation between the two professors. Just the remarkable range of questions that people in the audience had. And I think that I anticipate a similar thing happening with this topic as well, because the cosmos, we're all in it, and play and games are something that we can all relate to. You know, we have different relationships to it, but it's important, I think, to all of us in different ways.
You're listening to Nathaniel Deutsch. He is the director of the Institute for Humanities Research and also created the series of public dialogues called Questions That Matter. Play, Games, Life, and Death is the next event happening March 1st at the Kumba. And so one of the first things I think about when I look at questions like this and topics is, what's the definitions? What is the definition of play for you, Nathaniel Deutsch?
It's funny. Noah and I have had some conversations leading up to this, and when I hear the word, my immediate response is fun and something whimsical. But I have to say, in planning for this event, the seriousness that's also attached to the word has come more and more to the fore, and I'm not sure what to think about that. Like, whether that's an entirely positive thing, that to such a big degree, play has become not only serious but often serious business. And of course, if one were to look at it historically, there were always aspects of that. But I think more and more, as it gets commodified, and transformed into all these other arenas, it's possible that association between play and fun and pleasure and joy and childhood and all these things that certainly come to my mind may be eroded. So that's actually one of the things I want, I want to hear what Noah and Kimberly have to say about that. What does play mean, and how has it changed, and what is the future of play, and to what extent are games or gaming, to what extent is that about play?
Right.
Well,
if I understand the history of games, it's a fairly new discipline. They started researching and thinking about what are games and how are games useful in the 1900s. Or late 1800s, maybe, as sociology and psychology and all of these different disciplines are forming, they're starting to have this real question: how do we study games, and how then does the study of play parallel that history? Noah, you want to talk a little bit about that? I see you.
Yeah, no. Once you start to have people who identify people and communities of people as the things they study, inevitably games and play start to be part of what they study. But these people who are studying cultures are also coming from cultures, right? And a lot of that early work is not just marked by the cultures that are being studied, but also by the cultures that people are coming from, right? So some of those early studies of games and play, one of the interesting things is that they often come from people whose first language is not one that distinguishes between games and play, right? Like English does. So we try to then, when we translate those works, impose a distinction. We call the certain activities games, right? The more rule-bound activities and so on, and other ones play. Or we talk about playing a game, whereas in other languages it would be the same word. But also, for example, those people who were doing those early studies often came from cultures that had very strong ideas about gender. So, for example, they would look at the play of children in the culture they were studying, and they'd say, oh, well, this rule and goal organized stuff that boys are doing, that's play and games. And this other stuff that looks like it's more imaginative and fantasy oriented, some of these scholars would just say well, let's call that something else and let's sort of marginalize it, right? And then once we define games and play that way as a thing that boys do, then suddenly it turns out that boys play a lot more than girls do, right? But it's just tautological, right? And so part of what has been interesting in this boom of studying games that has come in the wake of games beginning to become more diverse in the roles they play in our society and becoming more economically important and so on, is that we've had to go back to some of that early work and how it framed things and question those framings.
Oh, that must be really fun. And so where would one study that? Are you in the literature department? Are you in the... and that gets back to the divisions and how that causes problems, because that then allows you to have that lens that you want to look upon that question.
Right. Well, part of why I'm at Santa Cruz is because I always want to say that you should be troubling those distinctions, but it also comes out of my history studying these things. So the earliest experience I had studying them was when I was a staff member at NYU. I took a graduate course with Richard Schechner, and part of what his contribution is to study things like ritual and performance and play by blurring the boundaries between what we think of as arts knowledge coming out of theater traditions and what we think of as social science knowledge coming out of anthropology and disciplines like that. And so that's always my preferred mode, is to say, well, let's assume we need at least two disciplinary lenses.
Which you're getting at this Questions That Matter event happening March 1st. Play, games, life, and death. You will have two very different perspectives. Kimberly Lau will be bringing her perspective. Noah Wardrip-Fruin, who was just speaking, will be talking about his perspective. And then the facilitator, the one who's going to be going back and forth, is Nathaniel Deutsch, the Institute for Humanities Research Director. So Nathaniel, when you start thinking about So I'm trying to think about how do you get ready for being a moderator? Obviously, you're going to have a lot of discussion with both Noah and Kimberly, but you're also having to do a lot of research yourself on the question, right? I mean, you're going to have to know as much as you possibly can so that you can see if maybe the conversation is missing something.
Yeah, I mean, to prepare for an event like this, I do reading on the subject. It usually grows out of a prior interest that not only I, but other people who are involved in planning the event have had, as well as what the energy on campus is. So UC Santa Cruz has a great gaming program. And it's a program that, as you can imagine just from listening to Noah, is very, very open to collaboration. I mean, that's really fundamentally one of the things that makes it a great gaming program. So I've already had conversations with Noah, with Michael, with others about this topic. And Kimberly and Noah and I have had conversations too, multiple conversations about some of the things we might talk about. But I also think it's important not to cover everything in those conversations, so that it's fresh. What I find, like in this conversation, right? I mean, you can think about what you'll say in advance, but when you're actually sitting down with a group of people. And this is something I think that's relevant for games too, right? I mean, games have rules, and you often have played the game before, but good games anyway, something new is created every time, and that's what makes it interesting and compelling. So, I don't want to extend the metaphor too much, but I think that I'm looking forward to the new thing that we'll create on the day of or the night actually of the event.
So, how much do you think collaboration comes into play when discussing play and games? Because it seems like it's pretty integral.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't have any experience designing games myself.
Well, I bet you've played games.
But I play games. I was a serious chess player. Mm-hmm. So I can say that even games that involve two antagonists, as chess does, and even to the point where in many countries it traditionally was considered a sport. I mean, because it's very physically draining, mentally draining. Even those kinds of games, have a collaborative dimension, and the greatest chess games are collaborations. And certainly, the newest generation of games are often heavily collaborative. So, the relationship between collaboration and competition is another interesting aspect of games, I think.
I'm really interested in thinking about play. Yeah. And where does play... I know you're not interested in those binaries, but where does play begin into games? Does there have to be a set of rules, and play doesn't need to have a set of rules?
That's a good question. Do you want to...
So what I tend to tell students in my introductory class is that we're not going to have an argument over the course of the quarter about what is and isn't a game. In fact, the last time I taught the class, I reserved that discussion of what is a game for the end, because I think it's more productive to focus on play and to think about what we're trying to do is create and interpret things that invite play and structure that play, right? And there are lots of different ways to invite play and structure play, some of which are, marketed by a giant game industry, some of which, we do at home with our friends. And if we can focus that way, we can also realize that we're all players. Whereas if you say, who's a gamer? Many fewer people raise their hands, right? Even people who might spend, hours a day commuting and playing games on their phone will say, I'm not a gamer. It's like, seriously? Because you clock more hours than I do, right? So I think it's also more inclusive to structure the conversation around play. Yeah.
But the questions that matter, the title of it is Play, Games, Life, and Death. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to be really interesting. I can't wait. March 1st. I think this is going to be such a great discussion. And as Nathaniel Deutsch was saying, a discussion that will also include the audience and those that come. And obviously, the people that show up and ask the questions are going to change how that all works. That's the beauty of interactivity in real time. You don't know what's going to happen, but you sure do know that it's going to be a really great evening of conversation and connection while exploring something that touches everyone's life. At least you want to think that everyone has some play in their lives, and what quality of life is there without play? So Nathaniel Deutsch, you are also the co-director for the Center for Jewish Studies, and you have a really great event coming up.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to tell people about it. On Wednesday, February 24th, from 4 to 6 p.m. in Humanities 1, room 210 on campus here, Todd Pressner is going to be giving the Helen Diller Family Endowment Distinguished Lecture in Jewish Studies. And the topic of the lecture is The Ethics of the Algorithm, Holocaust Testimony and Digital Humanities. So I want to invite everybody to come to that. And if you want to get those details, again, you can go to the Center for Jewish Studies website on the UC Santa Cruz website.
So Nathaniel, I have been looking at that title, and every time I wonder what could that possibly mean. So, and I'm trying to guess that Professor Preston is using big data. Is that perhaps how an interpretation might be of that title, to look at the archive, the huge database that we have that comprises the Jewish.
Yeah,
I'm trying to remember the name of the archive that's in Israel, and a part
Bashem.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I just think of that as this huge repository of, that big data would be able to, bringing those tools of big data could really have extract information in a way that we've never been able to before. Am I in the right path?
No, you're definitely on the right track. So Todd Pressner is a historian, and he also works a lot in digital humanities. And one of the ways in which the humanities can really have an impact in our own moment is on big data. I mean, it's funny because a lot of people think that, all this new information, all this data, it's all about quantification. But in fact, you could argue that the interpretation, the emergence of big data has made interpretation even more important, because whether it's medical data, or whether it's this kind of an archive, let's say with Holocaust testimony, you have to be able to interpret it. Otherwise, you just have this big pile of stuff, basically. And to say what it means is really the task of people like historians and others who can sift through and look for patterns and look for other ways that we as human beings establish meaning. So in his case, he's looking at, in this talk, he's going to be looking at an archive, the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, which is the largest archive of Holocaust testimony in the world. And it has 52,000 testimonies, 100,000 plus hours of video footage, and a database of some 6 million records. So that's a lot of information. And so it's unlikely that anyone's going to be able to actually, any single person anyway, go through and look at all of that or analyze the text that's produced by it. But using technology, you can go and look for keywords, or you can look for other patterns, other things that you can then construct meaning out of it in terms of narratives, in terms of things that you see coming up over and over again, in terms of the way that the individuals make meaning themselves and maybe make meaning over time. For example, you could do a longitudinal study and say, well, this person did an interview in 1950. A Holocaust survivor, let's say somebody who was in Auschwitz, one of the concentration camps. And then she did another interview in 1960, and another one in 1972, and another one in 1990, and another one in 2005. What were the different things that she mentioned? What was present in 1950 versus 2005? How did things change, for example, after the miniseries on the Holocaust came out in the 1970s, this groundbreaking TV miniseries? How did it interact, or can you historicize it and say, oh, she starts bringing up this kind of a thing after these events happened? after it became maybe more okay to talk about certain things in public that previously weren't. So those are the kind of things that historians, other humanities scholars can bring to big data, whether it's the Holocaust or some other topic.
And this database that he's going to be talking about, is that specifically here in the United States?
I'm trying to remember where that is.
Because it seems like that would also kind of change the data, because I know in Israel their database is probably going to be different.
Yeah, I don't know the exact...
Just because of the cultural aspects of...
Yes, I don't know the exact site of the...
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, but...
you come to the talk.
Right, so the thing... Right, so... that will be another very interesting thing to do, would be to compare, for example, this archive with the archive at Yad Vashem, which is in Israel, and to see whether things like what the national context
I think
is, and that's something that historians have looked at. How was the Holocaust received? How was it interpreted? How were Holocaust survivors treated? How did they understand themselves, depending on where they were living after the Holocaust, whether it was in Israel, the United States, France, Argentina, a variety of other places where they had large communities of Holocaust survivors.
And how that changes through the decades.
Absolutely.
We were just in Israel last year and had a conversation with one of our hosts, and I asked something about their, I think it was their grandfather, and I thought, well, if the person was pretty much of that age and they weren't from the Middle East, so they must have possibly come from Europe. And he said, we don't really talk about it in the family. It's something we just don't talk about. And his kids saw interviews of their relative on the TV, because they have a day of Holocaust remembrance every year where they actually stop everything, and I believe there's sirens that go off, and they have this moment, a long moment of thinking about it. And then there's also a lot of education that goes on in the elementary schools, and so families are learning about their own family members through this day of remembrance, and having it on the media. And so I just found that fascinating, that they're not talking about it directly. But that could have just been that family.
Yeah.
But it would be interesting to see if...
Sure, and that's so when you look at big data in a question like this, you can determine, at least to some degree, to what extent our experiences or the way that people reflect or don't reflect idiosyncratic, or to what extent do they form part of broader patterns.
Right.
So it's very important to bring that into play in researching these kinds of questions.
This is happening next Wednesday, February 24th.
That's right.
At what time?
4 to 6 p.m., so it starts at 4 p.m. in Humanities 1, room 210.
Nathaniel Deutsch, he's the co-director of the Center for Jewish Studies and the director of the Institute for Humanities Research. He's also professor in the Department of History here at UCSC. Nathaniel Deutsch has been bringing questions that matter to us. This is the second event that we're having, Play, Games, Life and Death. It's happening March 1st at the Kumbwa Jazz Center. 6 o'clock is when doors open, and 7 o'clock is when the conversation begins between Kimberly Lau and Noah Wardrip-Fruin. Thank you both so much for coming in on the show and talking to us about this event that I think is well, it's very close to my heart, and I can't wait to see it and hear it and hopefully maybe interact. And even if I don't ask a question, I know that after the talk, all of the audience members are more than likely going to want to talk about what came out in this series. Nathaniel Deutsch, I hope you can come back and talk to us, because I know you have many more events coming up. You guys have an event almost every week. It's wonderful, bringing the humanities to us here at UCSC and to the broader Santa Cruz community.
And to the world.
And to the world. And Noah Wardrip-Fruin, thank you so much for coming in. And I hope you also can come back when you have something fabulous, a new game, a new book, I don't know, all kinds of stuff we're expecting.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
My pleasure.